Welcome back to Still Farm Legacy, wishing you resilience in your work and peace in your moments of rest. And now, let's move into today's story from the land and the still.
The auctioneer's voice was a rhythmic, hypnotic drone, a sound as much a part of a Midwestern spring as the cry of a red-winged blackbird. But Eli Vance wasn't hypnotized. He was coiled tight as a spring, his knuckles white where he gripped the splintered top rail of the cattle pen. He stood in the back of the crowd, away from the chatter and the backslapping, his eyes fixed on the machine being dragged into place by a wheezing old Massey Ferguson. It was an Alice Chalmers HD6 crawler, a 10-ton lump of faded yellow iron that looked like it had been pulled from a riverbed. Rust wasn't just on it. It was a part of its very being, blooming in great leprous patches on the engine cowlings and along the hard-nosed grille. One of the massive track chains sagged like a drunk's grin, its pins worn egg-shaped. A dark, greasy stain wept from the belly pan, a testament to seals that had surrendered years ago. The blade, a heavy old straight dozer, was scarred and bent, its cutting edge worn into a useless, wavy smile. It was, by all accounts, junk. Eli could smell it from 50 feet away, the sour tang of old diesel, the faint, acrid scent of burnt hydraulic fluid, and the damp, earthy smell of the mud still caked in its undercarriage. To the other farmers gathered here in the spring of 1973, it was a joke, a relic from a forgotten age. They were here to bid on the late Mr. Abernathy's pride and joy, a nearly new John Deere 4430 with a sound guard cab and a purring 6-cylinder turbo. That was the future. The dozer was the past, and a broken-down one at that. But Eli saw something different. He saw a Buda Alice engine, a notoriously stubborn but simple power plant. He saw a main frame that looked straight and true beneath the grime. He saw potential, buried under layers of neglect and abuse. He needed a dozer. His back 40 acres had a drainage problem that turned it into a swamp every spring, stealing 20 acres of his best corn ground. And the hillside pasture washed out in every gully washer, sending his topsoil down into Miller's Creek. Renting a machine was out of the question. The rates were criminal. Buying new was a fantasy. This was a possibility, a slim, greasy, rust-covered possibility. "Well, I'll be," a smooth voice drawled next to him, "if it isn't Eli Vance, shopping for a new anchor for his boat." Eli didn't have to turn. He knew the voice, the smell of expensive cologne, trying and failing to mask the scent of dealership floor wax. Richard Sterling. Rich, as he insisted everyone call him. He owned the gleaming new Sterling Ag and Equipment on the edge of town, a palace of glass and steel where farmers were lured in with promises of easy credit and coffee that didn't taste like it was brewed last Tuesday. Rich wore polished Tony Lama boots that had never seen a feedlot and a crisp Western shirt. He was a salesman, first and last. "Looking for parts, Sterling?" Eli asked, his voice low and gravelly, not taking his eyes off the HD6. Rich laughed, a practiced, easy sound. "Hardly. Just came to see what kind of trade-in value I'm going to have to give on that 4430. But my God, Vance, you're not seriously looking at that thing, are you? The scrapper won't even give you $50 a ton for it. It's a money pit." "Might be," Eli conceded. "Might be? It's a guarantee," Rich pressed, stepping closer. "Look, I know you're trying to make a go of it since your dad passed, and I respect that. But you can't farm in the 70s with equipment from the 40s. You're working that old 4010 of your father's into the ground. I've got a brand new Case 1150 on the lot. Turbocharged, power shift transmission, air-conditioned cab. We can work out the financing. A low introductory rate. It'll pay for itself in the first year with the custom work you could do." Eli finally turned his head, his gaze flat and hard. He was 28, but the sun and the worry had already carved lines around his eyes. His hands were thick and calloused, the nails permanently rimmed with a mixture of grease and soil. He'd inherited the 240-acre farm 2 years ago after his father had collapsed, clutching his chest out by the grain bins. He'd also inherited his father's philosophy. If you can't pay cash for it, you can't afford it. The bank owned too many farms already. "And what's that introductory rate jump to after a year, Rich?" Eli asked. Rich's smile tightened just a fraction. "Well, it adjusts with the prime, but that's standard. It's about investment, Eli, leveraging your assets to increase productivity. You've got to spend money to make money. I've got to have money to spend money, Eli countered, turning back to the auction. And I don't like owing any man or any bank. Rich scoffed, a puff of condescending air. That's old-time thinking. Your dad was a good man, but that thinking will leave you in the dust. You'll be slaving away with a wrench in your hand while your neighbors are buying up the land around you. He clapped Eli on the shoulder, a gesture that was meant to seem friendly, but felt like a branding iron. You just bought yourself a boat anchor, son. Mark my words. The auctioneer started the bidding on the Dozer. All right, folks, what do we bid for this Alice Chalmers crawler? It ran when they parked it, that's what they tell me. Let's start it at $1,000. Who'll give me $1,000? Silence. A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Rich Sterling folded his arms, a smug look on his face. $1,000, $1,000, do I hear 1,000? The auctioneer pleaded. Come on now, the scrap price alone is worth that. 500 then. Who'll give me 500 to start it? Eli's heart hammered against his ribs. This was his moment. He'd sold 2 steers and held back on buying new planter discs just for this. He had exactly $3,500 in a separate envelope in his truck. Every penny he could scrape together. 500, a man from the local scrapyard called out. I got 5, now 6, 600. Eli let it go for a moment, letting the scrapper feel confident. The bidding climbed in $50 increments, slow and painful. It stalled at $900. Sold at $900 then? The auctioneer began, his gavel raised. 1,000, Eli said, his voice clear and steady. Every head in a 20-foot radius turned to look at him. Rich Sterling just shook his head, a look of pitying disgust on his face. The scrapper shot back. 1,100. 12, Eli said immediately. They went back and forth, the price climbing past what the machine was worth in scrap iron. The crowd was watching now, a bit of lunchtime entertainment. The Vance boy trying to outbid the junk man for a piece of junk. Eli kept his face a mask of indifference, but inside his stomach was a knot of acid. Every bid was a risk, a chunk of his operating capital for the year. The price hit 2,000, then 2,500. The scrapper was looking annoyed. 3,000, the scrapper yelled, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Eli's boot. Eli didn't flinch. He'd walked every inch of that machine. He'd seen the welds on the blade arms, the condition of the radiator core. He knew, with a mechanic's certainty, that the engine was sound. That was the heart of it. The rest was just steel and time. 3,200, Eli said, his voice quiet but firm. The scrapper hesitated. He looked at the Dozer, then back at Eli. He shrugged and shook his head, turning away. 3,200 going once, twice. The auctioneer's gavel hovered. Sold, for $3,200 to Eli Vance. A smattering of polite applause broke out, but it was mixed with murmurs and head shaking. Rich Sterling walked past Eli, not even making eye contact. Have fun with your anchor, he muttered, and walked toward the gleaming 4430, where real business was being done. Eli stood there for a long moment as the crowd's attention shifted. He'd done it. He'd just spent nearly a year's profit on a 10-ton pile of rust and problems. He felt a surge of triumph mixed with a wave of pure gut-wrenching terror. He owned it, for better or for worse. Now, before we get this old beast running, I've got a question for all of you out there who've turned a wrench. What's the oldest, rustiest piece of equipment you ever brought back from the dead? The one everyone said was scrap. The one that fought you every step of the way. But you won in the end. Let me know down in the comments. I read every single one. Getting the HD6 the 6 miles back to his farm was an odyssey of shame. The engine, after a great deal of coaxing and a can of ether, had belched to life in a cloud of black smoke that blotted out the sun. It settled into a rough, rattling idle, one cylinder missing rhythmically like a tired old heart. The left steering clutch was completely frozen. To turn, Eli had to lock the right track and let the machine pivot in a wide, lurching arc, tearing up Abernathy's yard in the process. He crawled along the shoulder of the county road at a pace that made a turtle look like a racehorse. Every farmer who passed him either slowed to a crawl to stare or honked and waved with a wide, pitying grin. He could feel their judgment burning into the back of his neck. There goes the Vance boy. Poor fool, just like his old man, stubborn as a mule and twice as dumb. He left a trail of drips on the asphalt, black engine oil, reddish transmission fluid, and the telltale milky green of a coolant leak. By the time he clattered and groaned his way up his own driveway, the sun was setting, casting long shadows from the oak trees his grandfather had planted. The dozer died with a final shuddering gasp right in front of the machine shed, as if it knew it was home and could finally give up the ghost. His wife Sarah came out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She had a worried look in her eyes, the same look she'd had for 2 years. But she forced a smile. "You got it home," she said. "Barely," Eli grunted, climbing down from the torn operator's seat. He was covered in grease, and every bone in his body ached from the vibration. "She's a mess, Sarah, a real mess." "But you can fix it?" she asked, her voice full of a hope he wasn't sure he deserved. "I have to," he said, looking at the silent, hulking machine. "I just have to." The summer of '73 was a blur of sweat, grease, and busted knuckles. After the corn and beans were planted with his reliable old John Deere 4010, the HD6 became his life. He dragged it into the machine shed, a cavernous old barn with a dirt floor and a single string of bare bulbs for light. He started the teardown. The work was brutal, a battle against rust and time. Every bolt was a war. He'd soak them in penetrating oil for days, heat them with his acetylene torch until they glowed cherry red, then lean on a 4-foot breaker bar with every ounce of his strength, praying the bolt would turn before the head snapped off. More often than not, it snapped. He filled coffee cans with sheared-off bolts and broken tools. He pulled the engine first. Using a chain hoist rigged to a heavy barn beam, he carefully lifted the 2,000-pound Buddha Alice diesel out of its cradle. He tore it down on a set of wooden blocks, meticulously laying out each part on a clean piece of plywood. The news was better than he'd hoped. The cylinder liners showed some wear but were still within spec. He measured the crankshaft journals with his father's old micrometer, the cool, precise clicks of the tool a comforting sound in the quiet barn. The journals were smooth, the bearings worn but not spun. A new set of rings, a valve job, and a full gasket set would bring it back to life. The transmission and final drives were another story. When he drained the fluid, it came out looking like a chocolate milkshake, a sure sign of water contamination. Pulling the final drives was a job for 3 men, but Eli did it alone with a collection of jacks, blocks, and pry bars. When he finally cracked open the housing, his heart sank. The bull gear was missing 3 teeth, sheared clean off. The bearings felt like they were full of gravel. It was a catastrophe. This was before you could just look up a part number on a computer. Eli spent his evenings at the kitchen table, poring over a greasy dog-eared service manual he'd ordered from a company in Nebraska. He'd get on the party line, the faint chatter of his neighbors in the background, and call salvage yards. He talked to grizzled old men in places like Kansas, Iowa, and Minnesota, describing the parts he needed, down to the last detail. "Yeah, I might have one of them," a voice from a yard in Wisconsin crackled over the phone. "Off a machine that burned. Gear might be okay, might be warped from the heat. Can't guarantee it." The next day, Eli was in his old Ford F-100 pickup, a thermos of coffee on the seat beside him, driving 300 miles north. He spent an afternoon in a field of mechanical skeletons, wrestling the heavy gear out of a burnt-out Hulk, and paid the man $200 in cash for it. He found used track rollers in a yard outside Des Moines and a set of sprockets he could build back up with his arc welder from a place in southern Illinois. It was a scavenger hunt across the American heartland, chasing down the bones of dead machines to resurrect his own. The whole county was watching. Rich Sterling made a point of driving his shiny new Chevrolet Silverado down Eli's road every week or so. He'd slow down, shake his head at the mechanical carnage spread across the barn floor, and then speed off, leaving a cloud of dust. The talk at the co-op coffee shop was merciless. "Heard Eli Vance is trying to build a dozer from scratch," one old-timer would say. "More like he's building a new anchor for that boat Sterling was talking about," another would cackle. "He's spending good money chasing bad. Should have just financed a new one. He's going to work himself into an early grave, just like his daddy." Even Sarah's father, a good man who farmed a section over by the river, pulled Eli aside one Sunday after church. "Son," he said, his face etched with concern, "I admire your work ethic. But pride is a dangerous thing. There's no shame in taking a loan to buy proper equipment. You're running yourself ragged for a piece of junk. Eli just nodded. I appreciate your concern, Frank. But this is my farm. I'll run it my way. He saw the worry in Sarah's eyes every night when he came in for supper, his hands raw and bleeding, his clothes stiff with grease. She never complained, but he knew she was scared. They were living on the edge, and he was pouring all their resources and all his energy into a machine that most people considered worthless. But every time he slid a newly cleaned bearing onto a polished shaft, every time a rebuilt component fit perfectly back into place, he felt a grim satisfaction. He was not just fixing a machine, he was forging his independence, one greasy bolt at a time. By the fall of 1974, the boom was on. The world was hungry for American grain, and prices shot to the moon. A bushel of corn, which had been worth a little over $1 when Eli's dad died, was now fetching close to $3. Land that had been selling for $500 an acre was suddenly going for $1,500, then $2,000. The mantra coming from the universities and the big iron dealerships was get big or get out. Fence row to fence row farming became the new religion. Rich Sterling was its high priest. His dealership, Sterling Ag and Equipment, became the epicenter of the boom. The lot was packed with monstrous new machines. Four-wheel drive Steiger Tigers with jewels all around, articulated Versatiles, and the new line of John Deere 8030 series tractors that looked like they could pull the world. The bank down the street had a loan officer who did nothing but process farm equipment loans, and he and Rich were best friends. Credit was cheap and easy. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly signing papers for $500,000 worth of equipment, convinced the good times would never end. Rich himself was the picture of prosperity. He bought a 200-acre farm that bordered Eli's land, paying cash. He tore out the old farmhouse and built a sprawling brick ranch-style house with a 3-car garage and a swimming pool. He traded his Silverado for a new Cadillac every year. He was a local success story, the man who saw the future and was cashing in on it. He still couldn't resist twisting the knife with Eli. He'd see Eli in town at the hardware store and say, with a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "Still playing with that old Tonka toy, Vance? I just plowed 160 acres yesterday with my new 8630 and a Rome plow. Didn't even stop for lunch. You ought to get with the times before they pass you by for good." Eli just ignored him. By then, the HD6 was alive. It wasn't pretty. The paint was a mismatched mess of Alice Chalmers yellow and rust primer red. The engine still smoked a little on startup, and the hydraulics whined under a heavy load. But it was strong. The rebuilt engine had a deep, throaty roar. The new-to-him bull gear held, and the final drives delivered solid power to the tracks. That fall, after the harvest was in, Eli put it to work. He started on the back 40, the 20 acres of swampy ground. He cut a deep drainage ditch along the low end, the dozer grunting and digging, the blade peeling back the wet, black earth layer by layer. He worked from sunup to sundown, the steady rhythm of the diesel engine a song of progress. The next spring, for the first time in living memory, that ground was dry enough to plant. He gained 20 acres of his most productive soil. The next year, he terraced the hillside pasture. It was slow, painstaking work, carving graceful swooping benches into the slope to hold the water and the soil. The neighbors thought he was crazy, wasting fuel and time on a patch of pasture. But the next time a big thunderstorm rolled through, his pasture held, while the creeks running off their fields ran thick and brown with their lost topsoil. Eli was making good money in the boom years, better money than his father had ever dreamed of. But he didn't act like it. He saw his neighbors buying new pickups, adding onto their houses, taking vacations to Florida. Eli took his profits and paid off his operating note at the bank. He bought a new set of tires for the 4010. He hired a crew to put a new tin roof on the machine shed. He replaced the old rotten fence posts around the farm. And the rest he saved. He put it in a simple savings account at the bank, where it earned a meager 3% interest, but it was safe. It was his. To the rest of the community, he was a failure, a man so afraid of debt, so stuck in the past, that he was missing the opportunity of a lifetime. They saw his discipline as fear, his caution as weakness. They saw him driving his old Ford pickup, wearing his worn-out work clothes, and they shook their heads. Poor Eli Vance just couldn't get out from under his father's shadow. The end of the decade came faster than anyone expected. It was the fall of 1979. Eli was at the grain elevator, waiting in line to unload. The line was long, full of brand-new air-conditioned tractors pulling tandem grain wagons. The man in front of him, driving a gleaming International 1486, shut his tractor off and walked back. "Can you believe this line?" the man named Peterson complained. He was a good farmer, but he'd bought a half section of land 2 years ago at $4,000 an acre. "It's harvest," Eli said simply. "Yeah, well, it better be a good one," Peterson grumbled, kicking at a loose stone. "Just got off the phone with the bank. The prime rate just hit 15%. 15, and the loan man says it's headed higher. He's talking about Volcker at the Fed being serious this time. How's a man supposed to make the payments on all this with interest rates like that?" Eli felt a cold knot tighten in the pit of his stomach. 15%. He remembered his father talking about the Depression, about what tight money could do to a man on the land. He listened as other farmers joined the conversation, their voices tight with a new kind of worry he hadn't heard before. The easy confidence of the past 5 years was gone, replaced by a nervous edge. Later that afternoon, as he drove home, Eli looked out across the flat, rich landscape. He saw the massive, articulated tractors still working in the fields, their headlights already cutting through the autumn dusk. He drove past Rich Sterling's farm, the big brick house lit up like a Christmas tree. He drove past the glowing sign of Sterling Ag and Equipment on the edge of town, the lot still full of shiny, expensive iron. Everyone was leveraged to the hilt, betting on the idea that prices would always go up and money would always be cheap. A dry wind rattled the cornstalks left in his own fields. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, but Eli could smell a storm coming. Not a storm of rain and wind, but something colder, quieter, and far more dangerous. He pulled into his driveway and shut off his old truck. He sat there for a moment, listening to the engine tick as it cooled. His gaze fell on the machine shed. Inside, sitting silent in the shadows, was the old HD6 Dozer. Its paint was faded and its seat was torn, but it was his. Every gear, every bearing, every bolt was paid for. In that moment, it didn't feel like an anchor anymore. It felt like a life raft. The dry wind of 1980 felt different. It wasn't the gentle, crop-drying breeze of a normal August. It was a hot, relentless blast that seemed to suck the very life out of the air. The corn, which should have been tall and dark green, was stunted and pale, its leaves curling inward during the day as if in prayer for a rain that never came. The sky remained a vast, empty bowl of searing blue. The farm ponds shrank, their edges cracking into intricate mosaics of dried mud, and the creeks slowed to a trickle. The drought was a physical manifestation of the economic sickness gripping the heartland. The interest rates Peterson had worried about a year earlier were no longer a distant threat. They were a cancer. The prime rate clawed its way to 16, then 18, then an unthinkable 20%. Loan payments that had been manageable were suddenly crushing. The confident chatter at the co-op had been replaced by hushed, desperate conversations about refinancing, about selling off a few cows, about holding on for just one more season. One sweltering afternoon, Eli was mending fence on the line he shared with Peterson. He saw Peterson's big International 1486 sitting idle in the middle of a half-dissed field, a plume of steam or smoke hanging over it in the still air. An hour later, a gleaming white service truck from Sterling Ag and Equipment pulled into the field. Eli kept working, driving steel posts with the heavy clang of his maul, but he watched out of the corner of his eye. He saw the mechanic in his clean coveralls shaking his head, saw Peterson gesturing wildly, his face red with more than just the sun. That evening, Peterson stopped his pickup at the end of Eli's lane. His face was pale under his farmer's tan. "Engine's shot," he said, his voice hollow. "Mechanic says I must have run it low on oil, but the light never came on. Said a sensor probably failed. A 50-cent part, and it cooked a $15,000 engine. Sterling wants 20 grand for a new long block and the labor to put it in. 20 grand. He laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "I don't have 2000. let alone 20,000. The bank already owns that tractor. Now I guess they can have the whole damn thing. Eli didn't know what to say. He just nodded slowly. I'm sorry to hear that, Tom. Yeah, well, sorry don't plant the wheat this fall, Peterson said, putting the truck in gear. You were right, Eli. You and your old man. We all thought you were crazy, sticking with that old junk. Turns out we were the crazy ones. The cracks were showing everywhere. Rich Sterling, who had once glided through town with the easy confidence of a king, now looked haunted. His smile was brittle, his eyes darted nervously. Eli saw him at the bank one morning, his voice sharp and tight as he argued with the loan officer behind a closed glass door. The dealership lot, once a showcase of power and promise, now seemed desperate. Big red banners screamed 0% down and no payments till spring. But the farmers weren't buying. They couldn't. They were just trying to survive. Sterling's own farm was showing signs of neglect. The weeds were creeping into his perfectly manicured fence rows. He'd sold off his beef herd to make a land payment, and the now empty pastures were growing up in thistle and buckbrush. The big brick house still shone on the hill, but it looked less like a monument to success and more like a fortress under siege. Eli, meanwhile, kept working. The drought hit him just as hard as anyone else, but his costs were a fraction of his neighbors. He didn't have a $4,000 a month payment to the bank. His fuel bill for the old 4010 was high, but manageable. When the hydraulic pump on his planter started to whine, he didn't call for a service truck. He pulled it himself, drove it into town to the old-school machinist who rebuilt it for $75 and had it back on and working the next day. He fired up the old HD6 dozer. The stock pond in his pasture was nearly dry, a stinking mud hole where his cattle stood miserably, swatting flies. The dozer roared to life in its usual cloud of smoke and settled into its familiar, lopsided rhythm. Eli spent 3 days in the blistering heat, carving the pond deeper, digging down into the cool, damp clay until he hit a spring seep. Water, clean and cold, began to pool in the bottom. He pushed up the dam, widened the spillway, and by the end of the week, his cattle had a reliable source of water to get them through the drought. He'd done it with his own 2 hands, his own fuel, and a machine that owed no one a single dime. One evening, Sarah found him leaning against the dozer, watching the sunset paint the parched landscape in shades of orange and purple. "You're thinking about them, aren't you?" she said softly, slipping her hand into his. He nodded, his gaze fixed on the lights coming on in Peterson's house, in Sterling's house. "They flew too close to the sun, Sarah. They believed the salesman and the banker. They forgot what the land teaches you." "What's that?" "That you can have good years, and you can have bad years," he said, his voice a low rumble like the dozer's engine. "But the debt is there every single year. It never takes a holiday. It never waits for a rain." He squeezed her hand, the calluses on his palm rough against her skin. "We're going to be okay." The storm finally broke in the winter of 1982, not a storm of rain, but of paper. The first foreclosure notice appeared in the county paper for a farm south of town. Then there were 2 the next week, then 5. Soon a full page of the paper was dedicated to legal notices, a weekly obituary for the death of family farms. The auctioneer's rhythmic chant was heard nearly every Saturday, no longer a sound of commerce, but of finality. It was the sound of families losing land that had been in their name for 100 years. The collapse of Sterling Ag and Equipment was swift and brutal. It started with the bank repossessing the tractors on the lot, a line of tow trucks hauling away the gleaming, unsold inventory of Steigers and Versatiles. Then the sign on the door changed from open to closed by order of the bank. The palace of glass and steel was empty, its showroom floor gathering dust, a tombstone for the era of easy credit. The final, inevitable notice appeared in the paper a month later. The auction of the Richard Sterling farm, all 200 acres, the brick house, the swimming pool, the machinery. Everything. The day of the auction was cold and grey, a raw March wind whipping across the barren fields. The crowd was huge, but quiet. They weren't there for the spectacle, they were there because they were scared, wondering who would be next. Eli stood at the back, just as he had at the Abernathy auction nearly a decade before. He saw Tom Peterson there, his face grim. He saw farmers who had once laughed at him, now looking at the ground, their shoulders slumped in defeat. Rich Sterling was there, standing beside his wife near the porch of the house he had built. He was a ghost of the man he'd been. His expensive suit hung on his thinner frame, his face was ashen, and the practiced, easy smile was gone, replaced by a permanent mask of shock. He looked like a man who had been in a terrible wreck and was only now realizing the extent of his injuries. The auctioneer, the same man from all those years ago, started with the machinery. The big, articulated John Deere 8630, Sterling's pride and joy, sold for less than half of what he'd paid for it. The combines, the planters, the plows, they all went for pennies on the dollar. The market was flooded with used equipment from other farm failures. There were simply no buyers. Then they sold the land. The auctioneer broke it into parcels. The first parcel was the 80 acres with the house on it. The bidding was slow, hesitant. No one had that kind of money anymore. It sold to a corporate farm from out of state for a price that was an insult to what Sterling had paid. Finally, they came to the last parcel, the 120 acres of prime bottomland that bordered Eli's own farm. "All right, folks, 120 acres of the best ground in this county," the auctioneer called out. "What'll you give me per acre to start?" $2,000. Do I hear 2,000? Silence. Land that had sold for 4,000 an acre just 3 years ago couldn't get a bid at 2. 1,500 then. Let's start it at 1,500. More silence. The wind howled around the corner of the barn. Eli felt a nudge at his elbow. It was his father-in-law, Frank. "That's good land, son," he whispered. "You've got the cash. You should buy it." Eli looked at the land, then he looked over at Rich Sterling. He saw Sterling's wife crying silently into a handkerchief. He saw the utter devastation on the man's face. This wasn't a victory. It was a tragedy. $1,000 an acre, Eli said, his voice clear and firm in the quiet crowd. A few heads turned. The auctioneer's eyes lit up. "I've got $1,000 from Eli Vance. Now 1,100. Who'll give me 11? No one spoke. The corporate farm had already bought what it wanted. The local farmers were broke. $1,000 going once, the auctioneer cried, his voice echoing in the cold air. Going twice. He looked around the crowd, his gaze pleading. Sold for $1,000 an acre to Eli Vance. Eli didn't feel a surge of triumph. He felt a heavy weight settle on his shoulders. He had survived. He had won the argument. But the cost was written on the faces of his neighbors. He walked to the clerk's table, his old, worn checkbook in his hand, and wrote out the check from the savings account he had so patiently fed for years. He paid cash. As he walked away, he saw Rich Sterling staring at him, his expression a mixture of hatred, disbelief, and something else Eli couldn't quite name. A flicker of grudging respect. Eli's own survival was a quiet affair. While his neighbors were selling off land, he was holding on. He had no debt, so the 21% interest rates didn't touch him. When corn prices fell below the cost of production, it hurt, but it didn't bankrupt him. He sold off a few steers from his small herd. Sarah took a part-time job at the town library. They cut back on everything, living as his parents and grandparents had, on what the farm provided. They ate from their garden, butchered their own hogs, and heated their small house with wood he cut from his timber lot. His old machines became his salvation. The John Deere 4010, with its simple bulletproof diesel engine, never failed him. He could overhaul the entire fuel system on his workbench in an afternoon with a few $100s in parts. When a neighbor's new computerized tractor went down, it sat in the field for a week, waiting on a circuit board from a warehouse in Moline. The repair bill running into the thousands. Eli's 4010 just kept running, and the Dozer, the old HD6, became a source of income. With the land devalued and cash scarce, conservation became a priority. The government started cost-sharing programs for farmers to build terraces and waterways to stop soil erosion. Suddenly, Eli was in demand. He was the only man for 50 miles with a Dozer who wasn't owned by the bank. He worked for his neighbors, clearing brush, building dams, shaping the land to save the precious topsoil. He charged a fair price, far less than the commercial contractors, and often took payment in hay, or a side of beef, or help at harvest time. He was rebuilding the community, one bucket of dirt at a time, with the same machine they had all laughed at. A week after the auction, Eli was in his machine shed, grinding the valves on a head from his pickup truck engine, when a shadow fell across the doorway. It was Rich Sterling. He looked even worse than he had at the sale. He wore old jeans and a tattered work coat. The polish was gone from his boots, replaced by a layer of mud and dust. "Vance," he said, his voice raspy. Eli switched off the grinder and wiped his hands on a rag. "Sterling." Rich shuffled his feet, his eyes scanning the organized chaos of the shop. The old lathe in the corner, the drill press, the neat rows of wrenches on the wall. His gaze finally settled on the HD6, parked in its place of honor at the back of the shed. "I came to... well, I don't know why I came," he stammered. "To see the man who beat me, I guess." "Nobody beat you, Rich," Eli said quietly. "The numbers beat you, the interest rates. You made a bet, and it didn't pay off." Rich let out a short, harsh laugh. "A bet? I bet everything. The house, the farm, my wife's inheritance, everything. We're living with her mother now. I'm trying to find work, but who's going to hire a failed equipment dealer?" He looked at Eli, his eyes full of a pain so deep it was startling. "You knew, didn't you? All along you knew this was coming." "I didn't know what was coming," Eli corrected him, "but my dad taught me to farm for the bad years, not just the good ones. He said if you can make it through the drought and the low prices, the good years will take care of themselves." Rich nodded slowly, absorbing the simple wisdom. "Leverage," he whispered, the word tasting like poison in his mouth. "That's what they taught us in business school. Leverage your assets. It's the American way." "It's the banker's way," Eli said. "The land has its own way. It's slower." An awkward silence fell between them, filled only by the dripping of a faucet and the coo of a pigeon in the rafters. "That land you bought," Rich said, his voice cracking. "The bottomland. My grandfather cleared that land with a team of mules. I was going to give it to my son." Eli took a deep breath. This was the moment. He could have turned the knife. He could have said, "You should have thought of that when you were signing the papers." He could have savored the victory he had earned through a decade of ridicule and hard work. But looking at the broken man in front of him, he felt no triumph, only a shared sorrow for the harshness of the life they had both chosen. "I need someone to farm it," Eli said, his voice even. "I can't handle that much ground by myself. I'll rent it to you. A standard crop share agreement. You do the work, we split the crop. You can use my equipment until you get back on your feet." Rich stared at him, his mouth agape. He looked around as if expecting to find someone else Eli was talking to. You'd do that? After everything I said? After how I treated you?" "We're neighbors," Eli said simply, as if that explained everything. "And you know how to farm. You just forgot what it was about." Tears welled in Rich Sterling's eyes. The pride and the arrogance that had defined him for so long finally crumbled, and he wept, not with self-pity, but with the shocking, painful relief of unearned grace. Years passed. The farm economy slowly healed. The land regained its value, but the lessons of the crisis were seared into the soul of the community. The flashy, high-risk operators were gone. The ones who remained were survivors, more cautious, more resourceful, more like Eli Vance. He never became a big farmer, but he was one of the most respected. His farm was a model of efficiency and sustainability, his terraced hillsides and well-drained bottoms a testament to his foresight. Rich Sterling became a good tenant, and eventually a good friend. He never got back into the equipment business, but he farmed the land his grandfather had cleared, and in time he bought it back from Eli, paying him a fair price with interest. One warm autumn evening, many years later, Eli stood on the hill overlooking his farm. He was older now, his hair streaked with grey, his hands thicker and more gnarled than ever. His son, David, a young man with his father's steady eyes, stood beside him. They looked out over the fields of corn and soybeans, the harvest nearly complete. "It's a good crop, Dad," David said. "It's a good crop," Eli agreed, "but don't ever let one good crop make you foolish." His gaze drifted to the machine shed. The old HD6 Dozer was parked outside, its faded yellow paint glowing in the last rays of the setting sun. It hadn't been used for serious work in years, but Eli kept it running, a functional monument to a philosophy. "You see that old Dozer?" Eli said, his voice taking on a softer tone. When I bought that thing, everyone in the county laughed at me. They said I was a fool, stuck in the past. They were all buying new, shiny machines on credit, getting bigger, getting richer. He paused, the memories washing over him. Then the hard times came. The interest rates went crazy and the prices fell out. And all that new, shiny iron became an anchor that dragged them under. I watched good men, my neighbors, lose everything. But that old Dozer, it didn't have a payment book. It didn't care what the prime rate was. It just worked. It drained the swampy ground that gave us an extra 20 acres of corn. It built the terraces that saved our soil. It earned us cash when we had none. That rusty old pile of junk saved this farm. David looked at the Dozer, then back at his father. He was beginning to